You are listening to the Roberta Glass True Crime Report, putting the true back in true crime. From New York City, Roberta Glass is now on the record. My guest, Jane, is a volunteer with the National Organization of Victims of Juvenile Murderers. She got involved in the movement after becoming concerned with the unethical tactics being used by advocates of juvenile criminals. Jane is not her real name. She's not using her real name because she fears the violent criminals and the activists working to free them. Welcome, Jane.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for doing this. So, why aren't you using your real name, and why do you feel these activists are dangerous?
Well, first off, a lot of these activists are themselves convicted murderers. When they were teens, they committed these murders and they got out, and now they're trying to get other teen killers out. And if they're not convicted murderers, they're supporting them. And this movement has a lot of power and money behind it, and so I just feel like using my real name might put my life and my family's life in jeopardy. And also, our website, teenkillers.org, we used to allow the comment section to be open, but we had to end that and close the comment section because offenders and their families were coming and harassing the victims. So this is a very scary movement to free some of the most dangerous criminals in America, and I just don't feel comfortable using my real name.
Understandable. So what is the National Organization of Victims of Juvenile Murderers, and why did you get involved?
We're called NOVJM for short, and it's an organization made up of people whose loved ones were murdered by juveniles. We started because after, we'll talk about this in a minute, but after the juvenile death penalty was abolished, there was a massive movement started to free all these killers, to end life without parole for them. So we felt that we had to organize. We give each other support. We allow people to join our organization even if they agree with freeing these killers. We're about supporting each other, informing each other in this extremely strange movement. I'm not a victim. I have not lost a loved one to a juvenile killer, but I decided to get involved because, well, in college, I read the book Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson, and it's a pretty good book mostly, but then he has these chapters where he talks about these juvenile killers. And just the way he talked about them, trying to diminish their culpability, these are children. These are kids making mistakes. I thought, well, that's not true, because I had heard about some crimes that we're going to talk about in a minute that were just, I can't even describe how terrible they were. And these were not mistakes. And so I saw that there was this big movement to reduce the sentences of these juvenile killers, and that it didn't really care about the facts of these cases, and it didn't care about the victims. The victims are being completely forgotten. I just thought that I have to get involved and be a voice for the voiceless.
That's interesting. So Bryan Stevenson's book had the opposite effect on you.
Yes.
Instead of joining his movement, you decided to join the opposition.
I saw right through the propaganda, the manipulative language he uses to talk about these killers, and I thought, you know what? I have to support these victims because the movement, it's all about the offenders. It's cruel to these offenders to put them in prison for this long. It's all about them. The victims are forgotten. And I thought, you know what? I have to stick up for the voiceless, the underdogs.
You said something interesting before we started recording, which is, I'm a young person. I remember what it was like being a teenager. Can you talk a little bit about that, about your age and how that really makes you question some of the propaganda?
Well, right now I'm 23, so I was 17 6 years ago, and I guess that's kind of a long time ago, but it's not long enough to where I don't remember it. So I remember what it's like to be 16, 17, and I know for a fact that at that age, that murder is wrong. At that age, you're pretty immature and impulsive, and you don't really think things through, but you know that killing people is wrong. And so I think that when they try to say that these juveniles are less culpable, that's just wrong when they try to say that these juveniles don't know what they're doing when they kill people.
How did this movement to free juvenile murderers begin?
Well, in 2005, the Supreme Court abolished the death penalty for juveniles in the Roper versus Simmons case. And pretty much immediately after that, the juvenile justice reform activists went after life without parole. LWOP is the short way of saying life without parole, so that's what I'll be calling it for this interview. So this movement, just like the innocence fraud movement, which you talk about a lot, has quite a lot of money and power behind it.
Who are some of the people behind it? I know the ACLU is one.
ACLU is one, the Equal Justice Initiative, Brian Stevenson. There's a whole organization dedicated to freeing teen killers called the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth, CFSY. I call them the Campaign to Free Scary Youth. Yeah, and so there's several other organizations. Those are kind of the big ones. And what I think is interesting, especially about CFSY, is that a lot of the activists there are themselves teen killers. When they were juveniles, they committed murders and went to prison. Now they've gotten out and are trying to free other teen killers, which I think is really interesting. And that's honestly why I'm not using my name, because these people are scary.
Mm-hmm. And what is Roper versus Simmons?
Roper versus Simmons, that's where the Supreme Court abolished the juvenile death penalty. Their logic was that juveniles are categorically less culpable because they're more immature, impulsive, they don't think things through, they're more reckless. But it's kind of silly that out of all cases, this is the case where they ruled that. Because the crime, Christopher Simmons is the offender in this case, it was the complete opposite of what the court was talking about. He decided that he wanted to kill someone for fun. And so he created this elaborate plan, and he finally did it. He broke into this woman's house, tied her up, kidnapped her, and took her to a state park and threw her in a river as she was tied up and drowned her. It was extensively planned. It was not impulsive. It was not immature. He took great precautions to not get caught. There was no peer pressure because he was a leader of the group doing it. So it's kind of silly that the Supreme Court says, well, Simmons can't get the death penalty because most other teenagers are immature and impulsive, even though he was not immature and impulsive.
Oh, that's interesting. And that's the landmark case, right?
I think that there were always people who wanted to get rid of LWOP for juveniles, but the movement didn't really take off until after this.
So what is the average age of a juvenile who gets LWOP?
About half of them were 17 when they committed the crimes, and maybe 35 or 40% were 16, and maybe 10 or 15% were 14 or 15.
So we're not talking about 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds?
No.
Right, okay. And what factors are considered when a juvenile is sentenced?
Well, in Miller versus Alabama, the Supreme Court ruled that LWOP cannot be given to a juvenile automatically. It can't be mandatory. There has to be a sentencing hearing. And at that hearing, you have to consider the so-called hallmarks of youth, which, immaturity, impulsivity, failure to appreciate risks, recklessness, and stuff like that. And so those hallmarks of youth and other mitigating factors are considered. And also, just like in any sentencing hearing, a judge will consider the aggravating factors as well. And an aggravating factor is basically something that makes the crime worse, such as killing a child, committing a murder during the course of another felony, stuff like that.
So if peer pressure is considered, are LWOP cases the most egregious?
Yes. Because first of all, when you have a juvenile who has gotten LWOP, because of Supreme Court law, what that means is that a judge or jury has considered the mitigating factors in youth. And they've decided that despite all of that, LWOP is an appropriate sentence, and that the aggravating factors outweigh those mitigating factors and those hallmarks of youth that may have been involved.
And there's no better example of this than Daniel William Marsh. This is a recent case. Can you talk about that?
First of all, Daniel Marsh, the judge gave him the maximum sentence of 52 years to life. But because of California law, he's actually eligible for parole in 25 years because California passed a law saying that juveniles like him can get parole in 25 years. Daniel Marsh was a diagnosed psychopath. His score on the psychopathy checklist was 35.8 out of 40. Since he was about 10 years old, he was fantasizing about torturing and killing people. And over time, these fantasies got worse. People who knew him, friends, peers, and so on, remembered that he would draw out really graphic pictures depicting torture and murder. He talked a lot about how much he wanted to kill people and how fun it would be. And he was really interested in serial killers like Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer. And he decided that he wanted to be a serial killer. And so one night in April 2013, after years of homicidal urges, he decided that, you know what, I'm actually going to go out and do this. I'm going to kill someone and see what it feels like. And so that's what he did. He extensively planned the crime. Remember, this is not impulsive, just like in the Roper versus Simmons case. This is not impulsive crime. He taped the bottom of his shoes so that he wouldn't leave footprints. He wore gloves so that he wouldn't leave fingerprints or DNA. He wore all black. And he took extensive measures to be able to commit this crime and not get caught. So he went around Davis, California, and just basically kept checking doors and windows to all the houses, trying to find an open door or window so he could break in. And he finally found that at the home of Chip Northup and Claudia Malpin. Claudia's daughter is a member of NOVJM. This is an older couple. Claudia was 76 and Chip was 87, and they were sleeping in their bed. Daniel Marsh broke in through the open window. When he first went through the window and into the house, he was in the living room. He followed the sounds of snoring to get to the bedroom. He went into the bedroom and just kind of watched them sleep for a little bit, fantasizing about killing them and thinking about how he would do it, the methods he would use. And then at some point, Claudia woke up and saw that there's this strange guy standing over her bed, and she started screaming. And after that, he started stabbing her to death. Chip woke up as well, and he stabbed him to death. In total, Claudia had 67 stab wounds, and Chip had 61 stab wounds. So this was, I don't know how to say it, this was a severe attack. And after he killed them, he eviscerated them, he removed their organs, and he mutilated their bodies. He dissected them, cutting open parts of their bodies to see what it would look like. He was pulling fat out of Claudia's leg to examine it. He tried to cut her eye out to examine it, but he wasn't able to do that. And also, in addition to murdering and mutilating this couple, he really enjoyed it. He later described the feeling the crimes gave him as the most enjoyable feeling he had ever experienced. And he said that this high that he got, this great feeling he got from committing these murders, lingered for weeks.
And he especially liked it when they were resisting.
Yeah, he said that the positive feeling he got from committing the crimes was heightened when the victims were conscious and resisting.
And even in this great high, he also was thinking about the investigators.
Yeah.
Can you talk about what he did at the scene to confuse them, besides wearing tape on his shoes?
He found a cell phone and a drinking glass, and after he eviscerated Claudia and Chip and ripped their organs out, he placed the drinking glass into Chip's empty body cavity and the cell phone into Claudia's body cavity. And he later said that he did this to, quote, fuck with the people who had to investigate it. But overall, this was a very mature crime. The only reason he got caught was because he bragged about it to his friends. And again, he told his friends that it felt so great to commit these murders and it was such a wonderful feeling. He wanted to do it again. That's the only reason he got caught. He left no DNA, no fingerprints, no other evidence. The day their bodies were discovered, 25 FBI agents came to investigate it, but they couldn't find any evidence. So I think the juvenile court judge in one of the hearings described this crime as a highly sophisticated crime, even for the most hardened, seasoned adult criminal. So that's what we're talking about here.
So is this unusual for juveniles who get LWOP? I mean, this shows a great deal of psychopathy, that double murder.
No, there are actually many juvenile crimes that are just as heinous as this one. One story I like to tell, because this is an especially terrifying crime. This comes out of Chicago in 1985. So Savannah McCann was a little 5-year-old girl who lived on the 5th story of the Henry Horner homes, the housing project in Chicago. And she had just moved there with her family. And one day she met a man named Johnny Freeman, and he was 3 months away from his 18th birthday. And somehow he enticed her with candy and then lured her to a vacant apartment on the 14th floor of the project. And there he raped her. And I'll just emphasize this point that he was raping a 5-year-old. I mean, think about the biology of that. That alone is just extremely evil. This was not a mistake, as the advocates of juvenile killers call these crimes. This was evil. So after raping this 5-year-old, he tries to kill her by throwing her out the 14th-story window. But Savannah somehow managed to hang on to the window ledge with her fingertips, and she was screaming, "Mommy, Mommy," because Freeman later was interrogated and confessed to this. So he admitted that as this poor little 5-year-old girl was hanging off the 14th-story window ledge with her fingertips, she was screaming for her mother. Freeman didn't give her a second chance. He peeled her fingers off the ledge, and then he threw her out the 14th-story window, and she fell 14 stories, and so she would obviously die. Another example we talked about is Daniel LaPlante. This is in Massachusetts in the 80s. LaPlante broke into the home of the Gustafson family and was burglarizing it. But then when some of the family came home, that was Priscilla Gustafson and her 2 children. Abigail was 7 and William was 5. And also Priscilla was pregnant as well. So when she came home with her 2 children, they interrupted this burglary, and from there on, Plant first tied Priscilla to the bed and raped her, and then shot her in the head and killed her. He then killed the two children, Abby and William, by drowning them in bathtubs. Again, this is a triple murder. Two of the victims are children. There's a rape involved. This is not an immature teenage mistake. I think one of the other crimes we wanted to talk about was the one that happened in Georgia in 2013. So Sherry West was a mother, and she was strolling her 13-month-old son, Antonio Santiago, home from the post office. And they were both attacked by two armed robbers. Dominique Lang was 15 and DeMarquise Elkins was 17. Elkins, first he pointed the gun at them and demanded money. After Sherry told him she had no money to give him, he threatened to kill her baby. Sherry begged for her baby's life, but it wasn't enough. This 17-year-old robber didn't care. He shot her in the leg, and then he went over to the 1-year-old baby, who was at this point crying in his stroller after just watching his mother get shot. Elkins points the gun at this 1-year-old baby's forehead, and he pulls the trigger and he kills him execution style. Because he shot him at close range. This was an execution style murder of a baby.
And in all these cases, I mean, it really goes against the argument that these are impulsive cases.
Yes.
Because Johnny Freeman had a chance to save Shavannah McCain's life.
Yes.
And didn't.
This was a planned out crime because he lured her to the apartment.
So that certainly destroys some of the propaganda.
I'll put in the comments section some more examples listeners can look at.
Speaking of propaganda, how does this movement use images to create public sympathy?
Well, they use photographs. I'm not even kidding. Like I said earlier, most of the juveniles who get LWOP are 16 or 17. In their publications, the anti-juvenile LWOP activists use photographs of 5, 6, and 7-year-old child models. I'll just leave that there. I mean, a picture of a 6-year-old does not accurately represent a 16-year-old murderer. I mean, it is just outrageous, the propaganda. And it's very upsetting to victims. If you were a woman who watched as a 17-year-old shot your baby in the face and killed him, imagine then seeing him portrayed as a 6-year-old little boy.
And they also use language. Can you talk about the language that they use?
Sure. One of the favorite buzzwords of the teen killer movement is children. They almost never call these killers juveniles or minors. They always call them children. And this is because, well, first of all, in American English at least, and I think in English in other countries, the term children or child refers to people who are pre-adolescent kids. But again, these juveniles who are getting LWOP are mostly 16 or 17. These are not pre-adolescent children. So just alone in terms of age, the term is inaccurate. Also, it creates a false image because obviously the term children is associated with innocence and vulnerability and all these, traits that actual children have. And these traits don't apply to 17-year-olds who murder babies in front of their mothers. Also, the NOVJM, we feel that by using this term, the activists are exploiting the natural urge we all have to protect actual children. And actually, a lot of these victims of juvenile murders were children. Shavannah McCann was a 5-year-old child. Abby and William Gustafson were 5 and 7-year-old children. Antonio Santiago was a 1-year-old baby. I mean, we have a case in Texas, Catherine Cardenas. She was 2 years old. She was kidnapped, raped, beaten, and strangled to death by a 17 or 16-year-old juvenile. That 2-year-old child who was raped and murdered, she was a child, okay? The 16 or 17-year-old, I think he was 16, Jose Arredondo, he was not a child. He was a juvenile. It's just, the term is very inaccurate. It paints a false image, and it's very offensive to victims. Again, imagine if you're the father in the Gustafson case. Your pregnant wife, and then your 2 children plus that unborn baby are all brutally murdered. How would you feel if the killer was referred to as a child and his culpability was minimized and he was painted as just this innocent, vulnerable little kid? I mean, it's extremely cruel to victims.
Another phrase they use is justice-involved youth. What does that mean?
It's really silly because what they mean is justice system involved. But first of all, there's a difference between justice and the justice system. When you say justice involved instead of justice system involved, you're making it sound like they're involved in justice, it's just the opposite. Murder is legally recognized as the greatest injustice there is. So these murderers are the opposite of justice involved. They are involved in creating the worst injustice possible. even if you sort of say justice system involved, we feel that that is still kind of a propaganda term because it kind of implies that, oh, they just got involved with the justice system. They didn't really do anything to get there.
They were just helping out in the office. They were involved.
Yeah, oh.
They were involved in the justice system.
Yeah, so they didn't do anything to get there. They just, the justice system just kind of swept them up. It takes away accountability.
They saw the justice system, they decided to get involved. They started to volunteer.
Yeah.
Maybe clean up around the place a little bit. Another thing you were telling me about is how they use language to make the murderer sound like the crime happened to them.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
The way they use language too, and when they're not, because oftentimes these guys outright lie about these cases. When they're not lying, they really kind of minimize them. So I think the example we used is the Donald Torres, the way Equal Justice Initiative just butchered the story of it really happened. I'm reading from an Equal Justice Initiative article. First of all, let me explain that Donald Torres was 14 years old. He was on the younger side, but he got LWOP for a good reason. He burned an entire family alive. At first he was kind of a troubled kid, and he did something like he threw a rock at the father's car. The father is Harry Gott. This is a Gott family. And Harry Gott decided, you know what? I'm going to take this kid under my wing. I'm going to help him instead of, telling the police what he did. And so over time, Torres befriended the Gott family. They had him over for dinner. They went fishing, stuff like that. And one time, Harry Gott scolded Torres for teaching the 3-year-old son to play with matches. So for some reason, this really enraged Torres. And I think it was a couple days later, in the middle of the night, he broke into the Gott family's home. He spread kerosene all over the house, including the stairway leading to the bedrooms. And then he set it on fire. The husband, wife, and the 3-year-old son and the 1.5-year-old daughter died. They were all burned alive. So just keep that in mind when I'm reading what the Equal Justice Initiative really wrote about Torres. He burned an entire family alive. Here's a quote. Equal Justice Initiative represents Donald Torres, who was sentenced to die in prison in Delaware for an offense that occurred when he was just 14 years old. First of all, this was not an event that just occurred, okay?
It spontaneously occurred, Jane.
Yeah, he was just walking by the street, and all of a sudden, it's an offense that was committed by him, okay? It was not something that just occurred. At age 14, Donald Torres was arrested for his involvement in an arson in which 4 people died. He was tried as an adult, convicted of murder, and received a mandatory sentence to die in prison. First of all, let's break this down. Involvement. He was not just involved in this case, okay? He was not the getaway driver. He did not supply kerosene and matches while not knowing what they would be used for. He was the principal offender. He's the guy that spread kerosene around the house, set it ablaze, and intentionally burned the family alive, okay? He was not just involved in this attack. Also, the way they minimize it, an arson case in which 4 people died. Okay, no, what you mean to say is an arson attack in which 4 people were murdered. They didn't just die. This was not like an accident. This was a murder. He was convicted of 4 counts of murder. Also, throughout the entire article, they refer to Torres as a child because he was 14. Which again, child is their buzzword to manipulate us and to exploit our natural urge to protect actual children. The Equal Justice Initiative declines to mention that 2 of Torres's victims were actual children, ages 1.5 and 3. So they don't tell the full story, and they make it sound like Torres was just kind of, he was involved in this case, he didn't really do anything big. It's lying by omission.
It sounds like he was a witness to his own life. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's what they make it sound like.
It's unbelievable. Another one of their arguments is that these children, as they put it, these juveniles, should not be judged by the worst thing that they've done. Can you speak to that?
Oftentimes the line is, and it's a buzzword line, it's no one should be judged based on the worst mistake they've ever made. First of all, again, we're getting into using manipulative language. These crimes were not mistakes, okay? When you call something a mistake, you kind of imply that the person didn't intend the consequences and that they didn't foresee them. That's not the case. When Donald Torres, for example, spread kerosene throughout the entire house and then set it ablaze, his intention was to burn the family alive and kill them, okay? He did not just I don't know, accidentally knock a bottle of kerosene over and, then he tried to light a candle with a match and then, a fire started. He intentionally burned the family alive. So just by calling these crimes mistakes, that alone we feel really kind of minimizes them and honestly is propagandistic. The idea that you shouldn't be defined by your worst act, it's one that most of us agree with. I mean, if the worst thing you've ever done is tell a nasty lie or shoplift or, cheat on a test or something like that, I would agree. You shouldn't be judged completely on that. But when the worst thing you've ever done is raping a 5-year-old and throwing her out the 14th story window, I think you should be defined by that because that crime is so terrible and the crime goes against society's standards so much that if we were not to define you based on that, we would basically be saying that the crime isn't that bad. So when you commit a crime that evil, you should be defined by it. Let's remember the victims, they're defined by the crimes because they're dead. So for these killers, to do these awful things and then say, oh, well, it's okay for me to kill these people and to take away their lives, but, this crime, it won't ruin my life. I get to move on. It doesn't make sense.
You brought up the idea of throwing, it's another one of their arguments. We're throwing away the youth's future.
Yeah, and often that kind of ties into one of their other claims, which is that these kids deserve second chances. First of all, a lot of these juveniles who get life or long sentences have extensive criminal histories and they have had second chances. Okay, we have a guy in Ohio who was sentenced to LWOP for the murder of 2 people, and prior to that, he had 35 cases in juvenile court. Another great example is what happened to Vicki Larson. Vicki Larson's mom is now deceased, but before she died, she was an NOVJM member. So a man named Scott Darnell, he was 15 years old, he lured Vicki into a cornfield and raped and murdered her. She was 10 years old, so he raped and murdered this 10-year-old. The only reason Darnell was allowed to murder Vicki was because he was on summer release and had been released early. Previously, he had committed several rapes. He tortured animals. He was a hallmark psychopath, but he was given summer release, a second chance, and he used that second chance to murder Vicki. And just to bring up one more case, one more great example of why the second chance language is really inaccurate is the Rachel Elton case from Utah. Rachel was a 22-year-old young woman who worked in a group home for juvenile sex offenders. And living in this group home was a man named Robert Houston. He was 17 and a half. The only reason he was at that group home was because he had previously committed 2 knife-point sexual assaults, okay? So instead of going to prison, he's sent to this group home for juvenile sex offenders. He gets a second chance. During his stay at the group home, he plans and attempts to commit more rapes. I believe the people he was targeting were female staff workers there. Again, he's not sent to prison. He's allowed to stay at the group home. He's given a second chance or a third chance. And then finally, he rapes and murders Rachel. He tricks her into giving him a ride to another independent living house where no staff and no residents are present. And there he rapes and stabs her to death. So he was given, second chances, third chances. I don't know exactly how many chances he was given because I don't know exactly how many crimes he had committed before. But regardless of the exact number of second chances he got those second chances. And he, instead of taking those chances to improve himself, he raped and murdered a young woman. And so this is not out of the ordinary. A lot of these juveniles who get life and long sentences do have extensive criminal histories, and they've had second chances. Also, you talk about the way they talk about these killers' futures, like, oh, they're throwing these kids away. We're throwing away our most valuable resource, our children. I'm sorry, but the guy who shoots a 1-year-old baby in the face in front of his mother because the mother won't give up her purse, that guy is not our future, okay? We don't need him in society. I mean, they make it sound like these killers are going to cure cancer. They're not. The guy who rapes a 5-year-old and throws her out a 14-story window is not going to cure cancer, okay? We have enough people in our society who really do have, positive contributions to make. I mean, I'll tell one more story. That's the story of Eve Carson. She was a 22-year-old young woman. She was the student body president for the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and we have a memorial for her on our website. Eve was a member of the academic advising program, the Athletic Council, the Carolina Leadership Development Board, the Chancellor's Committee for University Teaching Awards, the Chancellor's Search Committee, the Committee on Scholarships, Awards and Student Aid, Phi Beta Kappa, and UNC Chapel Hill's Board of Trustees. She also taught elementary school students and middle school students. She was a reflections leader for UNC's APPLES program. That stands for Assisting People in Planning Learning Experiences in Service. She was co-president of the Honors Program Student Executive Board, and she was co-chairwoman of UNC's chapter of Nourish International, which was a hunger relief organization. Her plan was to pursue higher education and study public policy or public health in graduate school, or she wanted to perhaps go to medical school or law school. So she had a bright future. She was about to start a job. She was just a couple months away from graduating with honors, and she was about to start a job as a management consultant at McKinsey & Co. But she never got to do this because two men, ages 17 and 21, murdered her. They kidnapped her, they drove her to several ATMs and robbed her and forced her to withdraw money, and then they murdered her to eliminate her as a witness. And this entire time that she's being kidnapped and held captive, she is begging for her life and telling these kidnappers, you can take the money, you can take whatever, just please don't kill me. Her last words were, pray with me. But they killed her anyways. See, Eve was a person who actually was going to make positive contributions. And when those two men killed her, they not only robbed her of her life, they also robbed society of all those contributions she would have made. So it just seems kind of stupid to say that the guys who murdered her brutally, that they should get second chances, they should, become community leaders, and they're going to cure cancer. We need them. But this poor girl, it's really too bad she's dead. You know what I mean?
Yep. And, the media also doesn't fact check. I mean, one of the worst cases of media inaccuracy in true crime reporting has to be the Cyntoia Brown case. Can you talk about the way the media portrayed Cyntoia Brown and what the reality of the case against her was, why she was convicted?
Well, Cyntoia Brown murdered Johnny Allen as he was asleep. And the reason she murdered him was to get his money, to rob him, and to have fun, to see what it would feel like to kill people. The evidence against her is overwhelming. First of all, the physical evidence. Johnny was found lying on his side with his fingers interlocked. She claims that she thought he was reaching for a gun. That's impossible. Okay, he was asleep. She also bragged about this to many people. She told her neighbor that, I shot somebody in the head last night and blew his brains out. And she told this neighbor that the murder was a fat lick, which is slang for robbery, and that she had been waiting on a lick like that all week. And she asked him to drive her back to Johnny's house so she could steal more stuff. She admitted to some of her jail cellmates that she made this self-defense story up. And actually, there was a note she wrote to one of her cellmates which said just that she had made the self-defense story up. And a forensic document examiner verified that this was her note, that she wrote it based on the handwriting. She attacked a nurse, and during this time that she was attacking the nurse in this mental health facility, she was screaming, I shot the man in the back of the head, and bitch, I'm going to shoot you 3 times, and would love to see the blood splatter on the wall. And so she's bragging about this to several people. She's threatening to kill more people. I mean, the evidence is overwhelming. Yet, because of a mob of people led by our favorite Kim Kardashian, who's now free. I mean, in this mob, look, the media got this story wrong, okay? They spread the lie that she was a sex trafficking victim who killed her pimp in self-defense. Okay, that's not what happened. At most, Johnny Allen was a John, okay? He picked her up for sex. That's at most. And also, but I feel like I have to mention that Johnny Allen's family believes that he only picked her up so that he could give her a place to stay because he understood her to be homeless. And he actually does have a history of being a youth pastor, stuff like that. So it is possible. Even if he was a John who was going to sleep with her, so what? That doesn't mean you get to kill him.
Certainly not. And it really took off in the media that this young girl was trafficked and killed her abusive pimp. And boy, was that not the story. What is Ohio Bill SB 256?
It looks like it's going to be a new law. Unfortunately, it passed the House and Senate. This stunning amounts of money were put into this. And I don't think DeWine has signed it yet. When he does, we will have something to say. What it does is it reduces sentencing options for juvenile killers. If you commit a non-homicide, you have to be eligible for parole after 18 years. So actually, it doesn't just reduce sentencing options for juvenile killers, it also reduces sentencing options for other juvenile offenders. So if you're a juvenile and you commit a non-homicide, like a rape, you have to be eligible for parole after 18 years. If you commit a murder of one person, you're eligible for parole after 25 years. And if you murder two people, you're eligible after 30 years. There is a very narrow exception for juveniles who kill 3 or more people. Those people can get life without parole. It was the least they could do. And the only reason this exception is in there was because of a man named TJ Lane. In 2012, when he was 17, he murdered 3 people at the Chardon High School, and he got LWOP. And actually, prior to SB 256, there was another bill that would have retroactively reduced the sentences of all juvenile offenders, including Lane. I believe that this bill would have made him eligible for parole once he turned 40. And the only reason it failed was because it would have made Lane eligible for parole, and that would be very politically unpopular because he's a very notorious criminal in Ohio. So with 256, first what they did is they said that if you're a future mass killer who kills 3 or more people, then you are eligible for parole after 30 years. If you are a person who is already in prison and has already been sentenced for the murder of 3 or more people, then you aren't eligible for parole. And it was just so blatantly obvious that the only reason this was in there was to prevent TJ Lane from getting out. I mean, they might as well have just written in there, if your name is TJ Lane and you murdered 3 people at Chardon High School, you cannot be paroled. That was basically why that was in there. That was the whole reason for it. Finally, the Ohio Prosecuting Attorneys Association got them to amend the bill so that both future and current or past mass killers who kill 3 or more wouldn't be able to get out. But yeah, that's why that was there. And there's some problems with the triple homicide exception. First of all, it only applies to juveniles who actually kill 3 or more people. It doesn't apply to attempted murders. So if you go on a shooting spree and you shoot 30 people, but 28 of them survive and 2 die, you're required to be eligible for parole. It requires that the offender be the principal offender in each killing. So if you're an accomplice to a mass murder, you're required to be eligible for parole. We actually have a guy named Jordan Wade who was an active participant in the murders of 4 people and the attempted murder of 1 other during a home invasion robbery. It was terrible. They invaded this home, took the occupants hostage, forced them all into the basement, and then the adult accomplice asked Wade, should I off them all? Meaning, should I kill them? Talking about the victims here. And Wade said yes. And then the adult partner in crime shot all the victims, killing 4 and wounding 1 16-year-old girl, and she played dead and survived. But because Wade was not the actual trigger man, he is required to be eligible for parole after 25 years. Even though he literally said, yes, do it, kill them. Even though he is directly responsible for the murders of 4 people. Jordan Wade is not the only criminal whose sentence is being reduced by this bill. These criminals that I just named, Jacob LaRosa, Jordan Wade, maybe their crimes weren't as notorious as TJ Lane's mass murder at Chardon High School, but they're no less heinous. So it doesn't really make sense that the lawmakers gave Lane this special treatment, and they said, okay, well, he can't get out, but it's okay for these other guys to get out. Here's what I think is possible. Either the lawmakers are hypocrites and that they really do care about justice for TJ Lane's victims, and they really do think Lane is a danger and they don't want to see him get out, okay? If so, they're very hypocritical because, first of all, the first version of the bill would have allowed future mass murderers to be paroled. So if Lane is too dangerous to be paroled, so is a future mass murderer. If Lane doesn't deserve to be released, neither does a future mass murderer who kills the same amount of people or more. And also, just again, these other killers whose sentences are reduced by this bill, their crimes are no less heinous. So if Lane doesn't deserve to get out, neither do they. But what I'm really starting to think, and at first I gave the Ohio lawmakers the benefit of the doubt, but what I'm really thinking now is that the Lane exception was not because they really care about his victims and getting justice and keeping people safe from him. It's because Lane is especially notorious, and if they vote to free him, they won't get voted in again. So I think what happened there is that lawmakers really weren't thinking about the victims. They were only thinking about what would be best for them so they could promote their agenda of giving second chances, so-called, to teen killers and getting reelected.
And one of the arguments for SB 256 is that the parole board wouldn't release someone who's dangerous. How do you feel about that argument?
It's just not true. Parole boards release dangerous criminals all the time. And actually, on our website, under the Myths versus Facts tab, we have a whole page listing dangerous early releases. And these are just the dangerous early releases that we've been able to document. There's many more out there. And currently on that page, we list close to 100 dangerous early releases. And also, let's remember that parole boards actually, here's something really fascinating. Parole boards are more likely to release psychopaths than non-psychopaths. A psychopath is someone who is manipulative, has no remorse or compassion, and a handful of other traits. There's 20 traits on the psychopathy checklist, and a forensic psychologist examines the person and sees how much each trait applies and then gives them a score. And if your score is 30 or higher, you are considered a psychopath. And so psychopaths actually are more likely to get out early because they're able to manipulate. So it's just the opposite. Even though psychopaths are much more likely to reoffend, they are more likely to be paroled. So it's the opposite of what they say.
And you could see that in the Marsh case because he started taking the classes that he needed to take right before trial and talking about remorse. And
I just actually want to bring up that Daniel Marsh could potentially be getting out in a couple of years.
That's frightening. Absolutely frightening.
Yeah.
One of their big arguments, and I'm sorry we didn't get to this earlier, which is we've all heard that the brain doesn't develop fully until age 25. But there is also a theory called brain overclaim syndrome. What is that?
Brain overclaim syndrome is a concept that was developed by a University of Pennsylvania law professor. And it's when people blame brains for offenses and not people. So, if your brain was a certain way, it doesn't matter what you do, you're not at fault. Your brain made you do it.
And one of the things that when I interviewed Jennifer Bishop Jenkins, who started NOVJM, she has a sister who went the opposite way. She befriended her sister's murderer and she really advocated for her. And Jennifer went the other way and she works with victims and making sure that her sister's murderer stays in prison. He's a diagnosed psychopath. But the language that was used to describe her sister who advocated for her sister's murder was such the language of love, that she's found forgiveness, that she's no longer living in a prison of hate. I mean, is this common kind of language to describe victims' families, that if they sort of join in with the movement, then there's this kind of praise and love and support and kind of vilifying people who just want to be the voice of their family member who's been victimized by this murderer?
One thing that's important to remember is that most victims whose family members are brutally murdered don't want to see that killer get out. A lot of them fear retaliation. There's also this idea that it's unfair for the killer to be out there enjoying the very freedoms that they denied the loved one by killing them. And so, understandably, most victims don't want to see that person get out. But for victims where this is a case, where they want there to be justice, they're kind of judged that, you're living in hate, you should move on. But it's not like that. They feel like they have to be the voice for their dead loved one.
And being the devil's advocate, what do you say to people who say, well, what if they come up for parole? They're never really going to get out, some of these worst cases that we talked about. What's the big deal if they come up before the parole board and they get denied? Why can't we give these people the opportunity at least?
Well, first of all, like I said earlier, parole boards do release dangerous criminals all the time. And when you have someone like Daniel Marsh, a complete psychopath, giving them even the smallest chance to be paroled is just too dangerous. And even if the person never gets out, the parole hearings themselves are extremely traumatizing for victims. Remember, most victims don't want to see the killers released, and they will fight parole if they have to. And when they're fighting parole, the impacts I've seen firsthand are terrible. A lot of victims, conditions that they got as a result of the murders, like anxiety, PTSD, and so on, those conditions flare up whenever there is a parole hearing. They suffer nightmares, flashbacks, panic attacks. A lot of them have the constant fear that the killer will get out and come after them next. So just the parole hearings themselves are extremely traumatic for victims, and that alone is a reason not to give these killers parole hearings.
Jennifer Bishop Jenkins said this is a $1 billion movement. What can my audience do to help victims, families, and fight some of these changes in the law?
So we're on the wolf and sheep's clothing show, and I think that that's a great analogy to describe these teen killer activists because they really are the wolves in sheep's clothing. Okay, actually, it would be the wolves in lamb's clothing because they portray these killers as young children, lambs. I like wolves, and I don't want to be mean to them by comparing them to these murderer advocates. So I feel kind of bad calling them wolves in sheep's clothing. Actually, a better term would be werewolves. These are the werewolves in lamb's clothing, and the werewolf is the truth. It's the movement to free some of the most dangerous criminals in America at the expense of public safety and victims' rights. And the lamb's clothing is this lie that, we're being compassionate, we're saving these poor children who've been sentenced to die in prison. And this lie is working. It is the werewolf in lamb's clothing. And also, there's another great line from, it's a line that we all have heard from Usual Suspects. And it's based on a French poet's line that the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world that he didn't exist. Well, I think that there's actually an even worse trick that a bad guy can play. And that is to trick the world into thinking that he is the good guy, that he is the victim. These teen killer advocates are portraying the murderers as victims. They're portraying them as 5-year-old little kids who just got caught up, involved in the system, and are sentenced to die in prison. They're portraying themselves as the good guys who are trying to free these poor children, when in reality, they're the bad guys. I mean, I'll just come out and say it. If you are trying to free some of the most dangerous criminals in America without any concern for public safety or for victims' rights, you're being a bad guy. But these bad guys have tricked politicians and the media and all these other people into believing that they are actually the good guys. I'm going on this big tangent because we have to fight this. And look, I got involved in NOVJM, even though I'm not a victim. And to be honest, I feel like I'm 23 and I'm kind of inexperienced. But nevertheless, I got involved and I've been able to help. And if you're listening to this and you are also outraged by the propaganda you heard about and the fact that there's this movement to free some of these evil killers, then you can also get involved. On our website, under the States and Legislation tab, we have a page called Current Legislation. We try to update that as much as we can. You can just follow that, and on the page for each bill, it'll say what you can do, message this committee, message this person, stuff like that. Another thing you can do is if you give me your email, I can create like an email list to send out. And so when there's lawmakers or a committee that needs to be contacted, I can send out like a boilerplate letter, and then you can send that to the lawmakers, if that makes sense. And if you want to do more, email me. My email is novjmlegislation@gmail.com.
Okay, that's a good place to end. If there is one message that you want the listeners to get from this episode, what would that be?
Wow, that's a good question. The message I want them to understand is that just because someone is under the age of 18 does not mean that their crimes are less heinous. Okay, 18 is kind of it's an arbitrary age. There's nothing magical about it. Look at some of the examples I gave, raping children, murdering multiple children. Those crimes are not less heinous because the killers had not reached their magical 18th birthdays. And yes, we know that juveniles are generally more immature, more impulsive, etc. But not all juvenile crimes are, immature, dumb, reckless mistakes. Okay, some of them are evil. And there are some juvenile criminals who should remain in prison without a chance to be released. For one, they don't deserve to get out based on what they did. Also, it's a matter of public safety. If someone is a psychopath, there is no cure for psychopathy. Unless there's some new technology created in the future, it is a scientific fact that psychopaths like Daniel Marsh cannot be cured. And also the victims. And even if, we could ensure that dangerous criminals would never be released, the impact of parole hearings on victims is enough to not have those hearings. Okay, so when, you look at all the downsides of giving parole eligibility to people like Daniel Marsh and DeMarcus Elkins, okay, you endanger the public, you traumatize victims, and you deny justice by allowing them to have sentences that are lighter than what they deserve. But what are the benefits? What are the benefits to having those people freed? Again, the guy who tortures and murders a couple in their home and then disembowels them is not going to cure cancer. There is no reason to give these people parole eligibility. The only reason that we're giving them parole eligibility is because it makes us feel good. oh, we're giving children second chances. Look at us. It's about feeling good and it's about promoting this agenda of freeing these killers, okay? It's a bad public policy decision, okay? We should focus on what's best for victims, society, safety, and justice, okay? Not what's best for evil murderers.
Agreed. I mean, really playing Russian roulette. Besides the impact on the victim's family, we're playing Russian roulette with the public's safety. It's absurd. Jane, thank you so much for speaking with me about this.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to all the listeners. Please email me if you want to get involved, and thank you very much for allowing me to come on. This was amazing. Thank you.
You're welcome.